Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. And I will introduce myself and then we'll kind of get into it. But my name is Dr. Catherine Queen Taylor. I am an assistant professor who's housed in women's studies here at San Diego State. I'm in my second year. Uh, but my area is assistant professor of feminist science and technology studies. And so I've had a very kind of odd background. I personally am very interested in looking at the ways in which science, in particular biomedical science, and other forms of knowledge production work together in concert with institutions and different kinds of practices and bureaucracies uh, to kind of shape the possibilities of life that are available for folks, and particularly folks from marginalized communities. And so, my personal background, kind of academically, I had planned initially to go to medical school. And so, I have a Bachelor of Medical Science in Immunology and Microbiology. But I was one of these weird people who was always asking strange questions about like the larger world that science happened in, and often about kind of this larger social and political and ethical issues. And one of the kind of first areas that I became really interested in was thinking about the management of intersex conditions in children. And this kind of stumbled me down this pathway into philosophy. So I ended up doing an undergrad, a master's, and a PhD in philosophy. And my areas are kind of philosophy of science, focusing on biology and medicine, social and political philosophy, feminist theory, um, that kind of stuff. I'm a intersectional feminist who, yeah, is really interested in thinking about not only the history of science, but how it functions today. And so I was thrilled to be asked to come in and meet y'all and talk about gender and science today. And as you'll see, there's so many things I could talk about under this umbrella of gender and like the relationship between gender and science. Like I could go in 800 different directions. And so what I'm going to do is start out with giving you kind of an overview of the ways I could talk about this, or like the things we could delve into. And I'm happy to answer all of your questions about all of these areas in the Q&A. But I'm going to focus in particular on one, and that is kind of the history of science, the role that biomedical science played in the invention of gender, like in the production of gender, and this thing that we come to understand as gender today. Um, and yeah, and then at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about the Science, Technology, and Society minor or studies minor program that I'm overseeing. I'm the advisor for it. Just launched earlier this year in fall, and I think it's a great program for folks who are maybe really interested in being scientists, being in STEM, but also thinking about STEM in this kind of larger way as well. So let's get started. Okay. Right. So as I said, there are so many ways I could talk about gender and science, friends. One of them is that I could talk about gender as an object of scientific research, because we're still doing lots of research that's to try to figure out like how are the genders different, what is the relationship between the gendered self and like our gendered desires, for example, like or gendered traits, like are women somehow worse at math? The answer is no. It's very obviously no. But there are folks who research this stuff. Uh, and I'm not going to lie to you, often do a very poor job at it. It's not good science, friends. But there's a whole field that is looking at various gender differences, right? Like it's taking gender difference as its object of study in some way. And so we can ask a lot of questions about this kind of research, and I think it's worth asking them. We can ask questions about how is gender defined in that research, right? Is it defined in terms of identity? Is it defined in terms of presentation? So whether you're, like more feminine appearing in your kind of bodily comportment and dress, or more masculine appearing. Um, we can also ask what areas are taking up these kinds of questions. So one of the areas in the example I'll kind of give is brain organization theory research. So you might have heard tell in the last few years of discussions about brain gender, and often these kinds of studies are attempting to identify kind of structural differences in brain organization, between men and women. And um, I'll also say, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A. All that research is really bad. We can ask ourselves, what kind of assumptions about gender does that research make? And I will tell you, for brain organization theory, it makes a lot of very problematic assumptions underlying its kind of research design and entire kind of enterprise. But we can also ask questions that we think might have like social and political and ethical importance, right? Like, what are the aims of this kind of research? Why are we doing it? And what kind of effects might they have, right? Like, we know that the kind of outcomes of scientific research, we know that science itself gives claims a lot of authority, right? Like, we think that science is a unique form of knowledge production, and we think it's important that people like believe scientific claims. Like, that's why we say stuff is science. That's why, for example, we want evidence-based coronavirus initiatives, stuff like that. Um, and so we grant that scientific claims can have a lot of impacts in the larger world beyond the scientific community. So we can ask questions about that as well. As I said, brain organization theory is, I think, a good example of that kind of research. We can also ask questions about how gender is included or how it's not included in scientific research, right? So again, we can always ask, how is gender defined, right? Because we might grant that gender is a kind of muddy thing, right? Like, we often talk about gender identity, but a big part of gender is clearly something about presentation and how one comports themselves in the world, what kind of clothing they wear, how they engage in the world with others. So, how are we counting our definitions? When we're saying women, are we including trans women? Are we not including trans women? If we're not, why aren't we? Right? Like, what is the justification there? Um, and so it's important to ask these questions about, like, when, why, and how is it included as a variable? Sometimes we might think that we're including gender when really that isn't the most important distinction, or the most important kind of difference along the lines, like if we're trying to look at certain kinds of patterns in data. Um, but sometimes we might think that it's actually vitally important that we do include it and take into account gender in a very important, right, and accurate way. So be clear about our definitions. We could also say, ask the question about, are there better and worse ways to include gender as a variable in research, right? It often will depend on what is our aim of our research, like what is the thing we're trying to prove or disprove, what is the thing that we are, or the phenomena we're attempting to capture. But the important thing here is to realize that the way we kind of construct categories isn't neutral, right? Like, it often does result in the exclusion of certain groups. And sometimes we might actually want to exclude those groups, but we need a justification for it, right? Like, it needs to be something that itself has some sort of evidence base underwriting it, right? And again, I think both of these times we can talk about what are the effects of this kind of research, both including and excluding gender as a variable. So here's, there are a few different examples I can point to, but here's a good one. One of them is osteoporosis research. So osteoporosis is something we generally identify with women. And we think that when we actually talk about it, though, I will say, we say that we identify osteoporosis with women, but we actually mean people who are assigned female at birth, right? So right away, like, there's a little bit of a messiness in terms of how we're using gender there, because really we're using it as a proxy for sex, right? And generally speaking, it's an area where, because we see this kind of stark gender division in outcomes, we do very gendered research. So research on osteoporosis heavily focuses on women at the expense of men. But it actually turns out that the thing that is the like the bigger indicator of whether you have kind of brittle bones, or and whether you're going to have a break because of them when you're older, is how much exercise you engaged in. So like if you're a woman and you're an athlete, osteoporosis is probably not a problem for you, right? But if you're a man who is fairly thin, didn't really engage in a lot of exercise over the course of your life, you might be as high of a risk of osteoporosis as your average woman, right? And part of the outcome, it might be actually like in that research, we use gender as a proxy for sex, when in reality, we should actually be using gender, but thinking about gender norms and gender differences. Like there is a theorist or one person in the field of this research who's argued that, in fact, probably the kind of disparities in osteoporosis that we see have more to do with social norms around women and eating, and women being small and thin, and women not engaging in exercise that makes them overly muscular, right? Like there are certain feminized forms of athletics we're into, but they're not the kind that necessarily might get you to be very large and muscular and kind of athletic in certain ways, right? And so we think about this as a kind of sex difference, a biological sex difference that probably has a lot more to do with the way that we treat people differently based on gender in the world, right? And so that's the kind of example I'm thinking of, but we can also talk about the ton of research where we exclude women or we don't do research on women. So for example, many of us probably have used birth control, oral birth control pills over the course of our lives. And even if you haven't, you might have been very familiar with all of the stories of all of the various side effects that can come with taking birth control pills, right? Now, folks have been talking about that for years and years and years and years. But the first actual like longitudinal rigorous study looking at particularly like the cognitive and emotional side effects of birth control pills on women just started at the University of Toronto in 2018. We have not studied that because the assumption is that women are responsible for family planning and birth control methods. This is a method that works and they're going to take it, right? No matter what the side effects are, they're just going to deal with it. So we've never really studied it until now. So there are sometimes where it's important to include it, sometimes where it's important to not. Another way I could approach this is thinking about gender representation in science or in STEM. And we all know that women are traditionally underrepresented in STEM. That's part of why groups like this exist. We also, and we can look at that in a variety of different ways, but we can note that that is not only a social justice issue, right? That the underrepresentation and the exclusion of women from certain fields, especially given that we know that STEM has historically been a really important pathway to middle class status for and kind of class mobility for people. And but we can also talk about this as an epistemic or like an issue of knowledge production, right? Like the fact that there are not enough women, not enough minorities in STEM changes the kind of research that we do and the kind of questions that we ask and the kind of things that we consider. And there are a lot of very kind of easy ways we can make this point clear, right? Like in my classes, I always give the example of if I'm developing a medication, I should start switching and talking about COVID vaccines, right? let's consider the first COVID vaccine. Part of this is because we're in such an urgent rush around the COVID vaccine, but the first, I believe it was I can't remember if it's the Pfizer or Moderna, but at least one of those COVID vaccines has to be transported at like minus 70 degrees, right? Like it needs to be kept in very cold and controlled conditions. But that is a system of vaccine that will only work in developed nations, right? Like you need to, that assumes you have consistent electricity, that you have consistent refrigeration and storage, that you have a consistent way of transporting things under refrigeration, consistent refrigeration, right? Like that kind of vaccine for the majority of humans in the world is just not usable. And if you're not thinking about that, or you're not, considering those contexts, which if you're not in that context, you might not be considering it, right? It changes the actual practical output of what our science gives us. And so there's so much stuff we can talk about this under this, like implicit bias stuff. We can talk about the social and political effects of this, all of this stuff. We can also talk about science itself as a gendered practice or a gendered endeavor. That is, that it is traditionally, STEM has traditionally a field that's been coded masculine. Often the kind of characteristics that we associate with the good scientist or people in STEM, like logic or reason or objectivity, are seen as typically masculine. But if you actually get into the history of STEM, this kind of gendered stuff is like it's right down into the roots of it. It is embedded within science in ways that like we don't even realize anymore. And my favorite example of this comes from Sir Francis Bacon. And so Francis Bacon, who I love this picture of him, I feel like he looks very like serious, is often referred to as like the father of empiricism. He is one of, if not the star of the scientific revolution. He gives us kind of empirical experimental science in the way that we understand it today. But he had, along with this kind of scientific practice that he introduced, was an entire conceptualization of, man as rational, dominating nature through scientific practice. And for him, nature is essentially female. And in fact, he talks a lot about who is the good scientist, what does good science look like? And his model is that of a good marriage. He says the good or ideal relationship between a good scientist and his work is like that of a good marriage between a firm but loving but also demanding husband who gets his wife to yield to his pressure, right? And in fact, he says like the discoveries of science are the children or the products of the marital couch between the good scientist and nature. Like he waxes poetic about this a lot, about like nature is mysterious, but the good husband gets to know her, and so he can coax her along to give up her secrets. And in fact, if any of you have ever in your lives had to calculate percentage yield, that term and that notion of calculating percentage yield comes from Bacon. And the yield is about the extent to which the good scientist husband has gotten his wife to yield to his pressure. This is the yield. It is the yield on the marital couch for him. And it is very much a kind of sexual domination. I bet you will never think about calculating percentage yield the same way again. Right? Like, never the same way. Francis Bacon. So these artifacts of this legacy are still with us, but they've become kind of detached in a way from the stories, or the way their actual origins. But for him, the scientific workroom, the lab is an essentially like a very kind of sexualized marital suite, right? Anyway, but here is the other way, and the last way, and the way that I'm going to talk about it for the rest of my time, and I will try not to talk too much because I'm a chatty Cathy, I'm sorry, is gender as a product of science. And so this is thinking about what role has and does science continue to play in the construction of gender, that is the creation of gender as the thing that we currently understand it to be. And hopefully many of you are familiar with the sex gender distinction. And so that is often the distinction that we invoke, where we like say sex is natural and has to do with like the physical body, but gender is cultural, right? Like, and gender is kind of the performative enactment of sex, or it kind of emerges out of sex, but it's the more like behavioral, performative, engaging in the world thing. But this distinction itself has a history. And this history is what I'll talk about for the rest of the time. But like, in order to kind of understand it, we got to first talk about sex. What is sex? Now, biologically speaking, across all species, sex is defined only by gamete size. So whether the germ cell you produce is the small one or the big one. If you produce a large gamete, you are a female. If you produce the smaller gamete, you are a male. That's it. And even then, that is a convention. There are a whole bunch of counterexamples to this. So there are species of algae, of fungi, of protozoa that have like the same size gametes that can't be sorted in this way. And so we'll use mating types in those circumstances. But when we talk about humans, and we're talking about biological sex in humans, it can be categorized in terms of at least 6 different components, at least. And there is a ton of variation within each of those, right? So we assume one of them is gonads. We assume that people can either only have ovaries or testes, but that is totally not true. You can have one ovary or one testy. You can have gonads that are a little bit of each. You can have gonads that are neither. They don't necessarily go together on either side. There's a lot of options here, friends. Then we can look at chromosomes, and we assume that folks can have XX or XY chromosomes. And even actually calling these the sex chromosomes is a bit of a misnomer, because you could have XX chromosomes and have a little piece of a Y on one of those X's, so that, you know, it ends up that your gonads decide to develop into testicles. Could happen, right? But there are actually a ton of different options that you can have. You can have XO, you can have XYY, you can have XYYY. These can develop in a variety of different ways. And what's important is that for all of these different components, their development doesn't have to be kind of in coherence with each other, right? Like you can have a phenotypically looking, kind of typically female body and still have XY chromosomes and still have testicles, right? Next is hormones. So we usually, this is actually even messier, I'm not even gonna lie to you. So like we'll say something like primarily androgens, like testosterones, or that should say, or primarily estrogens, but like also like estrogen, too much estrogen will turn into androgen. Like, it's a little bit messy. And so there are wide ranges of variations that occur here, and that can occur across the lifespan, but also you can have varying hormone sensitivity. So even if you produce a ton of testosterone naturally, your body could be completely insensitive to it. So it wouldn't really matter. And in fact, I should say, the International Olympic Committee's current definition of male and female is based on hormone level. But it is likely that 10% of all women will fail according to their definition. 1 in 10 will not make it on their definition. And the majority of those would have no idea. They'll never know. Um, oh, what happened there? Oh no, I replicated my slide twice. Well, that was sad. Okay, but I'll just tell you what the other ones are. This is so sad because I feel like that slide is sneakily in here somewhere else, and I'm gonna find it. Let me just look. Nope, it's gone. All right. Okay. So in addition to gonads, chromosomes, hormones, we have internal reproductive organs. So like whether you have a uterus and fallopian tubes, or whether you have seminal vesicles, stuff like that. You can also have like some of those things, but neither of those things. Then we can also talk about external genitalia. So whether you have a penis or a vagina or something in between, there are, again, a lot of variations, a lot of different options. Gonads, chromosomes, hormones. I'm missing one. My potential seventh one is brains. So whether we think that like, is the brain a sex organ? Do we think that there is a brain gender? Who knows? But the important thing is, it turns out that there are a lot of different kind of variables that go into sex. And these don't necessarily have to come in alignment, right? And in fact, the history within the history of biomedical science, the history of gender, that is gender as a characteristic of humans distinct from sex, is the history of trying to solve the problem of atypically sexed bodies, or bodies that don't cohere with standard accounts of sex, of binary sex. And so the first time that gender actually appears as a category distinct from sex ever in the English speaking world is in 1955. And it happens in this article, Hermaphroditism, Gender and Precocity and Hypoandrocorticism, Psychologic Findings by John Money. And this is the first time we see gender used ever as something that is referring to an attribute for humans that is distinct from sex. Now, that it doesn't mean like the word gender wasn't around. We often use that word, and frequently we'd either use it as synonymous with sex, or we would often use it with regards to language, so the gendering of words in various languages. But here is the first time it's introduced to mean something else. And this is John Money writing about this in 1995, writing about it 40 years later, where he says, quote, "Gender made its first appearance in English as a human attribute, but it was not simply a synonym for sex. With specific reference to the genital birth defect of hermaphroditism," that's a real problematic way to say that, "it signified the overall degree of masculinity or femininity that is privately experienced and publicly manifested in infancy, childhood, and adulthood." So when he says privately experienced, he means something like identity, or what we would say now is gender identity. When he says publicly manifested, what he means is the way that your gender role, like how you present in the world. He also at that time means sexuality. He thinks that's all part of it. And so he says, so this thing, and he says that usually, though not invariably, correlates with the anatomy of the organs of procreation. So he is well aware in 1955 that all these parts of the sex body don't necessarily go together. And so he introduces gender as this solution to the problem. He's like, what we need to do is try to predict gender, and then we assign through surgery sex so that it coheres with that gender, right? So I'm trying to predict what gender you'll be later, and then I'm gonna surgically assign sex to an infant without their consent and probably sterilize them in the process. And so he introduces this treatment model. And this is another kind of quote here, and he talks about kind of trying to come up with this. And he says the first step was to abandon the unitary definition of sex as male or female, and to formulate a list of 5 prenatally determined variables of sex. This is based on some data that he had looked at. And he's like, these variables, the data shows they can be independent of each other. So he has chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, internal and external morphologic sex. So all the stuff we've already talked about. Hormonal sex. And he notes that that can be different at puberty and prenatally. And then he says there's also this other thing. There's sex of assignment and of rearing. So what sex you were raised as, right? We can read that as like sex, what gender you were socialized as, right? And he says at the seventh was this, he says, unnamed blank that craved a name. After several burnings of the midnight oil, I arrived at this term gender role, conceptualized, as I said, private and imaginary and ideation, public and manifestation. And so he's trying to come up with a way to solve it. And he ends up, because the data he's looking at is data of folks who are born and who are raised with atypically sexed bodies in the 30s and 40s. He finds that 90% of them identify with the sex that they were raised as. And so, and we might think that makes sense, like gender norms in the 1940s. There's not a lot of room for wiggle room there. And so he finds the majority of them identify with the sex they were assigned at birth and the sex they were raised as. And so he decides that that is the primary determinant of gender over all of the biological stuff, right? And so he ends up introducing this treatment model called the optimal gender of rearing treatment model for intersex conditions. It comes up in the 1950s. And so what it recommends is that for every intersex infant, they should be surgically assigned a sex by 18 months, ideally within the first few months, where we do genital normalizing surgery, we remove their gonads and sterilize them, and then they need to be raised according to very strict gender norms. And in practice, this often meant lying to parents and to the individuals themselves about what happened and what their surgeries were, because we didn't want anyone to call into question whether that kid was like really what we assigned them, right? Because the money was really concerned that like if parents don't believe that their kid is really a girl, they're going to raise them in an ambiguous way, and then they won't really be a girl, right? And so gender is the way, like gender is this kind of technology for him. It's this way of like solving this problem and figuring out how to assign sex. And so the fascinating thing is, this is what gives birth to gender as we understand it today. So gender role, as he first introduces it, is then taken up by a guy named Robert Stoller. And Robert Stoller uses gender to make sense of trans folks. And he's the one who first introduces or like first creates the definition of transsexuality as a diagnosis that goes into the DSM. And then the first feminists, like second wave feminists who start talking about the sex gender distinction, they take it from Robert Stoller's work on trans people. And they're like, look, we can look at trans people and we can see that sex and gender come apart. So yeah, it might be the case that women are like sex differences are natural and like women are naturally different from men, but gender is socially constructed. And so gender oppression could be different, right? Like it could be otherwise. So they take a lot of political work out of this. But this is how we get our understanding of gender as we have it today, right? Gender as identity, gender as role, like behavior, as like non-sexual desires, as career aspirations, or like what kind of interests you have are gendered, right? But all of this is kind of codified through this treatment model, and then the years of scientific and biomedical research that proliferate out from it. So I'm going to end there because I already talked for too long. But I also wanted to end by just letting y'all know about the Science, Technology, and Society Studies minor program. So, as I said, we launched this just last fall, which was real weird to try to launch a minor program in a pandemic. I had all these fabulous plans of coming and visiting all your classes and handing out flyers, and then none of that happened. Um, but it's a program that allows students an opportunity to like explore the ways in which science and technology not only shape the world around us, but are shaped by larger social, political, economic and historical and institutional contexts. And I think, in some ways, I'm not going to lie, I feel like the program kind of sells itself in pandemic times. Like, if there was ever a time to think about the larger social and political and historical context of science and think about its effects, it's right now. But if you're the kind of person who's interested in thinking about these things, or even if you're at all interested in thinking about how this might complement your degree, if you're a person who's interested in going on to other graduate work, I think this is as a minor provides those of you who are in STEM with a lot of really, really essential kind of critical and analytic skills that I think we're just going to need moving forward. Like, I think in a lot of ways, this notion of like science as somehow removed from the world is gone now. And so we need the skills to actually think about it. So how do we do this, right? So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for having me. I look forward to answering all your questions. And I'll stop sharing so I can see your faces.